Let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered that the grave you've been crying over might be empty? Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. I'm a 58-year-old retired high school history teacher from Columbus, Ohio. I coached Little League on weekends. I made the best dry rub ribs in the neighborhood. My neighbor Frank would fight a grown man over those ribs, and I buried my daughter 2 years ago. Or at least, I thought I did. Sabrina, my firstborn. 31 years old, bright as a new penny, stubborn as a rusted bolt. She got that from her mother, Ashley, who will argue with a stop sign and somehow make the stop sign feel bad about itself. Sabrina had this laugh that could fill a room and then spill out into the hallway. The kind of laugh that made strangers turn around and smile without knowing why. She died, supposedly, on a Tuesday. Cardiac arrest, they said. Young, healthy women have hearts that just stop sometimes. That's what Rob told us. That's what the death certificate said. And because grief will make a rational man abandon every instinct God gave him, I believed it. Rob Anthony, my son-in-law. You know how some people walk into a room and the room gets warmer? Rob walked into a room and your wallet got lighter. I never trusted that man. Not from the first Sunday he showed up at our dinner table cutting his steak with the wrong knife and complimenting Ashley's cooking a little too enthusiastically. Nobody compliments Ashley's pot roast that much, unless they want something. But Sabrina loved him, and when your daughter looks at a man like he personally hung every star in the sky, you learn to smile and pass the mashed potatoes. So when she died, and Rob showed up at our door looking like a man auditioning for the role of grieving husband, I did what fathers do. I stepped up. He'd lost his job months before the funeral. Convenient timing I filed away in the back of my mind but never opened. Sabrina had been the breadwinner, so every Friday I drove to that man's apartment on Birchwood Avenue, knocked on door 4B, and handed him $600 in cash. Every single Friday. Ashley thought I was being generous. I told myself I was honoring Sabrina. Looking back now, I was being the world's most consistent, most punctual, most reliable fool. Now I need you to stay with me here, because this is where the story takes its first turn. It was a Thursday afternoon in March. Cold. The kind of cold that gets personal with you, climbs right under your coat and makes itself comfortable. I'd stopped at Hargrove's Pharmacy on Clement Street to pick up my blood pressure medication, which, given everything that was about to happen, was going to need a serious upgrade in dosage. Roy Abernathy had been the pharmacist at Hargrove's for 22 years. Quiet man, methodical. The kind of man who alphabetized his spice rack and felt genuine satisfaction about it. Roy and I weren't friends exactly, but we were the kind of familiar that comes from a man knowing your insurance information and your cholesterol levels. He slid my prescription across the counter, and I slid my card across to him. Normal Thursday. Boring Thursday. And then Roy did something he had never done before in 22 years of quiet, methodical professionalism. He leaned forward. He looked left. He looked right. And in a voice so low I had to tilt my whole body toward the counter, he said, "Alan, can I ask you something strange?" I told him strange was fine. He pulled up something on his computer screen and then turned the monitor just slightly, not enough for me to fully read it, but enough for me to see it was a prescription record. And then he said, "Is your daughter still, forgive me, but is Sabrina still alive?" I want you to understand what that sentence did to my body. My heart didn't skip a beat. It stopped, looked around in confusion, and then started beating in the wrong rhythm entirely. I gripped the edge of that pharmacy counter like it owed me money. I told him slowly, very slowly, that Sabrina had passed away 2 years ago. He knew that. He'd sent flowers to the funeral home. Ashley had a card, and Roy, calm, methodical, spice rack alphabetizing Roy Abernathy, nodded like he'd already suspected the answer and said, "Then somebody needs to explain why her prescriptions have been filled here every month for the past 18 months. Stop. I need you to sit with that for a second. 18 months. My daughter had been dead for 24 months, and for 18 of those months, someone had been walking into that pharmacy presenting her insurance card and picking up prescriptions in her name. I asked Roy who was picking them up. He shook his head and said he couldn't tell me that. Privacy laws. But what he could tell me, and this is where Roy Abernathy quietly became my favorite human being on the planet, was that something about the death certificate on file didn't sit right with him. He'd seen the record flagged once when the insurance company had questioned a claim. Just a routine thing. But Roy had looked at the certificate himself, the way methodical men look at things that don't quite line up. He said, "Alan, I'm not a documents expert, but I've processed enough records in this job to know when something looks off. The certificate on file, the seal, the registrar's signature, something about it just doesn't match the county format I've seen 1,000 times." I drove home in complete silence. Ashley called me twice. I let it ring. I was having a conversation in my head that I wasn't ready to have out loud yet. Because here is the thing about grief that nobody tells you. Grief is a negotiation. You spend the first months bargaining with reality. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe there's a mistake. Maybe, and then eventually you surrender. You accept. You rebuild your life around the absence of that person like a house built around a missing wall. You compensate. You adjust. And someone, some cruel, deliberate, calculated someone, had been standing outside that house, watching me compensate and adjust and collecting $600 a week. While they did it, when I finally got home, Ashley was in the kitchen. She took one look at my face and put down her coffee mug. She asked me what happened. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Sabrina used to do her homework, where she once spilled an entire bowl of cereal and blamed it on the cat we didn't own. And I looked at my wife of 34 years, and I said, "Ashley, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the day we identified Sabrina's body." The color left her face so fast it was like watching someone turn off a light. She whispered, barely a whisper. She asked why. And I said, "Because I'm starting to wonder if we identified the right person." Ashley's coffee mug hit the floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up, and somewhere across town, on Birchwood Avenue, in apartment 4B, Rob Anthony's phone was about to start ringing. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. They say the truth has a smell, like something left in a closed room for too long. You don't notice it at first, but once somebody cracks that window open, you can't unsmell it. You can't close the window back, and you absolutely cannot pretend the room was ever clean. Roy Abernathy cracked my window on a Thursday afternoon. By Saturday morning, the whole wall was coming down. I didn't sleep Friday night, not a single minute. Ashley and I sat at that kitchen table until 2 a.m., going through every memory of those awful days surrounding Sabrina's death, like two detectives who'd been handed a cold case and a pot of decaf. Ashley cried twice. I didn't cry at all, and if you knew me, you'd know that was the most alarming sign of everything. Alan Whitmore cries at insurance commercials. Alan Whitmore cried at the end of a nature documentary about sea turtles. Alan Whitmore was not sitting dry-eyed at 2 a.m. unless something inside him had shifted from grief into something much colder. Ashley kept saying, "But we saw her, Alan. We saw her at the funeral home. We identified her." And I kept coming back to the same thing, the thing that had been scratching at the back of my skull since the pharmacy counter. Did we, though? Or did we see a woman, in a casket, who Rob told us was our daughter? And we believed him, because what kind of monster would lie about that? Ashley went very quiet. Then she said, "The casket was closed at the service." I know. Rob said she wouldn't have wanted people seeing her that way. I know. We only saw her at the funeral home for about 4 minutes. You could barely look. I was hysterical. Rob handled everything. I know, Ashley. I know. Saturday morning, 9 a.m., I called my buddy Terrence Walsh, retired cop. Columbus PD for 26 years, the kind of man who'd seen enough of human nature to be permanently unimpressed by it. Terrence fished on weekends and spoke in short sentences and was exactly the person I needed at that moment. I told him everything. The pharmacy, the prescriptions, Roy's concern about the death certificate, the Friday payments to Rob. All of it. There was a long pause on the line. Then Terrence said, "How much have you given that man total?" I did the math right there on the phone. 52 weeks times 2 years times $600. $62,400. Another pause. Terrence said, "Alan." He said, "No, Alan, I don't think you do. Because what you just described to me isn't just suspicious. What you just described has a name. Several names, actually. And none of them are good." Quietly. He knew someone at the county registrar's office who owed him a favor. The kind of favor that gets paid back on a Saturday morning without paperwork. He told me not to call Rob. Not yet. Not to tip anything over until we knew what we were actually looking at. I agreed. Then I drove to Birchwood Avenue anyway. I know. I know what Terrence said. But I want you to understand something about being a father. Logic is a daytime thing. It works fine between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. But somewhere around the time the sun goes down, and you're sitting in a dark car outside your dead daughter's husband's apartment building, logic clocks out, and something much more primal takes over. I sat in that car for 40 minutes, watching the entrance. Second floor lights in 4B were on. I could see the blue flicker of a television through the curtains. And then, I want you to prepare yourself. The door to apartment 4B opened. Rob stepped out onto the small balcony, jacket on, keys in hand, going somewhere on a Saturday morning like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. I slid down in my seat like a teenager sneaking past curfew. $62,000 later, and I'm hiding from this man in my own car. The indignity alone was enough to raise my blood pressure 6 points. Rob got into his silver Honda Accord, bought, I now realize, probably on my money, and pulled out of the lot. I followed him. Now look, I am a retired high school history teacher. I am not Jason Bourne. I have never followed anyone in my life except once when I followed a food truck 3 miles across Columbus, because they had a jerk chicken sandwich that was genuinely life-changing. This was not that. I kept 2 cars back the way Terrence had once described to me during a barbecue story I'd only been half listening to. I blessed that barbecue. I blessed my own partial attention span. Rob drove 20 minutes east, out past the commercial strip, past the Garden Valley neighborhood, into a quieter residential pocket I didn't know well. Halcyon Court, one of those small streets with older ranch homes and big trees that make a neighborhood feel deliberately hidden from the rest of the city. He pulled into the driveway of a pale yellow house. Number 14. I parked half a block down and watched. He didn't knock. He used a key. I need you to understand what it means when a man uses a key. A man who knocks is a visitor. A man who uses a key lives there, or has been there long enough that living there and visiting there have become the same thing. I sat with that for a long moment. Then my phone rang. Terrence. He didn't even say hello. He just said, "The death certificate is fraudulent." The street went silent around me. Or maybe that was just the inside of my head. Terrence kept talking. His contact at the registrar confirmed it. The seal was wrong. An older format, discontinued 18 months before Sabrina supposedly died. The registrar's signature didn't match the official on record for that period. Someone had constructed a document, a convincing one, good enough to fool a devastated family who wasn't looking for fraud, because why would they be? But not good enough to survive scrutiny from someone who knew what to look for. I told Terrence where I was. I told him about the yellow house on Halcyon Court, about Rob and his key. A very long pause. Then Terrence said, "Alan, don't get out of that car." I told him I was just sitting here. He said, "I know you. You're sitting there, but you're also about to do something stupid. Don't. Give me the address. I'm coming to you." I gave him the address. I kept my eyes on the yellow house. And I need you to stay with me, because this moment right here is the moment my entire world split cleanly in two. A light came on in the front room of number 14, and in the window, just for a moment, the silhouette of a woman passed across the curtain. A woman with a particular way of moving, a particular tilt of the head, a particular way of pushing her hair back with her left hand that I had watched every day for 31 years. Every hair on my body stood up, because I knew that silhouette. I had watched that silhouette learn to walk, learn to ride a bike, walk across a graduation stage, walk down an aisle toward Rob Anthony while I stood at the front of a church trying not to completely fall apart. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I called Ashley. She picked up on the second ring, and before she could say a single word, I said, "Ashley, Sabrina is alive." The sound my wife made in that moment is not something I will describe to you. Some sounds are too private for a story. Some sounds belong only to the people in the room, or in this case the people on the phone, and nowhere else. What I will tell you is this. Across town, Terrence Walsh was already in his car. Half a block away, in a pale yellow house on Halcyon Court, my daughter, my living, breathing, deliberately hidden daughter, was moving around a kitchen like a woman who had absolutely no idea that her father was parked outside. And inside my chest, grief and fury and something that felt dangerously close to joy were fighting the kind of battle that doesn't have a clean winner. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't shout, don't throw things, doesn't pace the floor or slam doors. It just sits inside your chest like a stone that keeps getting heavier with every breath you take. Quiet, settled, absolute. That was the anger I carried up the driveway of 14 Halcyon Court. Terrence had arrived 7 minutes after my call. He'd pulled up behind my car, walked over to my window, taken one long look at my face and said, "Alan, I need you to promise me you're going to let me do the talking." I told him that was fine. He said, "I need you to actually mean it this time." I told him I meant it. We both knew I didn't mean it. Terrence knocked. 3 sharp, professional knocks. The kind that announce without apologizing. The kind that say someone who knows things is on the other side of this door. We heard movement inside. Voices. Low, quick. The kind of voices that belong to people recalibrating fast. Then footsteps. The door opened, and there stood Rob Anthony, in a gray sweatshirt and bare feet, holding a coffee mug, looking like a man whose Saturday had just driven off a cliff. The color left his face in one clean sweep. He looked at me, then at Terrence, then back at me. And whatever story he'd been prepared to tell for whatever version of this moment he'd imagined, I watched it dissolve completely behind his eyes. Terrence said, very calmly, "Rob, we need to come inside." Rob said, and I genuinely could not believe the nerve, he said, "This isn't really a good time." I said, "Rob, move." It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was the voice of a man who has coached Little League and taught teenagers, and raised a daughter and written $62,400 worth of checks to a fraud, and has now run completely, permanently, and irrevocably out of patience. Rob moved. The living room of that yellow house was comfortable. Lived in. There were 2 coffee mugs on the table. Not 1. 2, and a throw blanket on the couch arranged the way blankets get arranged when someone was just sitting under it. There were photographs on the shelf, turned face down in a hurry that was so obvious it was almost insulting. There were shoes by the door, women's shoes, size 7. Sabrina had always worn a size 7. I stood in the middle of that room, and I said loudly enough to reach every corner of that house, "Sabrina, come out here, please." Silence. Then Terrence, quieter but firm. "Sabrina, my name is Terrence Walsh. I'm a retired police officer and a friend of your father's. Nobody is here to hurt you, but this conversation is happening today, whether you come out or not." A door down the hallway opened, and she walked out. I am 31 years old. My daughter. Wearing a green cardigan I had never seen before over a white t-shirt, her hair pulled back, her face carrying an expression I had also never seen before. A combination of terror and relief, and guilt so layered and complicated, it would take a painter a lifetime to accurately capture. She looked at me. I looked at her, and the absolute first thing this child said to me after 2 years of allowing her father to grieve her, was, "Daddy, I can explain." I want you to appreciate that in 31 years, every single time Sabrina Whitmore had said the words "I can explain," she could not, in fact, explain. The time she was 17 and came home at 2 a.m., she could not explain. The time she rear-ended my car in the driveway, she could not explain. The woman had a perfect record of being completely unable to explain anything she'd ever needed to explain. But I sat down on that couch, because for the first time in 2 years I had my daughter in the same room as me, and even with a stone in my chest and $62,000 in the rearview mirror, I sat down, and I said, "Then explain." It came out in pieces, the way confessions always do, not in a clean straight line, but in fragments and circles, with tears filling the gaps between the parts she could say out loud. Rob had not always been the man he became. That was the first piece. In the beginning, he was good to her. Genuinely good, the way people are good when they're performing goodness for an audience. But 2 years into the marriage, things shifted. Financial pressure, bad decisions, then worse decisions, then the kind of decisions that attract dangerous people. Rob had gotten deeply indebted to the wrong individuals. Not a small debt, not a gambling tab or a bad loan from a bank. The kind of debt that comes with consequences delivered personally and physically. He hadn't told Sabrina the extent of it until the night 3 men showed up at their apartment door and made the stakes extremely clear. She looked at Rob when she said that part. He was staring at the floor. The plan, and she said the word plan like it tasted bad in her mouth, came from Rob. Fake her death, collect the life insurance, pay the debt, disappear, start over somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't be found. Terrence made a sound at that point, a very quiet, very controlled sound that communicated volumes. I said, "And you agreed to this?" Not a question, a stone hitting water. Sabrina's eyes filled up immediately, and she said, "I was terrified, Daddy. I didn't know what else to do. They said if we didn't pay, I said, so you let your mother identify your body." She flinched like I'd raised my hand, which I have never done, and would never do. But the truth landed on her exactly like that. She said, barely a whisper, "It wasn't my body. It was Rob arranged. There was a woman, a Jane Doe from the county. She had no family." Terrence stood up at that point and walked to the window. He needed a moment. "I understood completely," I said. "Sabrina, your mother hasn't slept a full night in 2 years. She goes to a grave every Sunday and puts flowers on it. She is in grief counseling. She blamed herself for not seeing signs of a heart condition that didn't exist. Do you understand what I'm telling you? And here is the brutal, complicated truth about being a parent. I watched my daughter cry, and every instinct I had wanted to cross that room and hold her. The same instincts that had been operational since the day she was born. They don't consult your anger before they show up. They don't check whether you have a right to still feel them. They just arrive." I stayed on the couch. Terrence turned from the window and looked at Rob with the particular expression of a retired cop who has been patient long enough. He said, "I'm going to explain to you very clearly what happens next. What you two have done constitutes fraud. Insurance fraud, falsifying a death certificate, obtaining money under false pretenses. The fact that we're sitting here having a conversation instead of waiting for squad cars is entirely because of the man sitting on that couch, who has more restraint than you deserve. But make no mistake, this gets resolved. Legally. Fully. Today." Rob started to say something. Terrence said, "I wasn't finished." Rob stopped. Terrence continued, "The insurance payout gets returned. Every dollar Alan gave you gets documented and repaid. You will cooperate fully with whatever process comes next. And if I find out for one single second that either of you attempt to disappear before that happens, I will make one phone call, and you will not enjoy what follows it. Are we clear?" Rob nodded. Small. Defeated. A man who'd been running a con so long he'd forgotten that cons eventually end. And they always end facing someone who isn't impressed. I stood up. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. This woman I had mourned. This woman whose absence had added 10 years to my face and taken something from Ashley that no counselor had fully been able to restore. This woman who had my mother's nose and Ashley's stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a room and spill out into the hallway. She was looking at me like a person waiting for a verdict. I walked across the room, and I held her, because she was my daughter. Because she was alive. Because 2 years of grief will make even a wronged man prioritize presence over pride in the moment when presence is suddenly, inexplicably, miraculously available again. I held her, and she shook, and I said nothing for a long time. And then I stepped back, held her at arm's length, looked at her face, and I said, "When we get home, you are going to sit across from your mother at that kitchen table, and you are going to look her in the eye, and you are going to explain every single thing. Not to me, to her. Do you understand?" Sabrina nodded, still crying. I said, "And then, eventually, after a significant amount of time during which you will be doing a great deal of apologizing and a great deal of listening, we are going to figure out how this family moves forward." I picked up my keys from where I'd set them on the table. I looked at Rob one final time. I said, "As for you, Terrence will be in touch. I have nothing else to say to you today, because the things I actually want to say to you are not appropriate for a Saturday morning." Terrence coughed in a way that was definitely a laugh. I walked out of that yellow house on Halcyon Court and stood on the driveway in the March cold, the same cold that had been personal with me 2 days ago. It felt different now, less hostile, like weather instead of a punishment. I sat in my car. I called Ashley. She picked up immediately and said, "Alan, what's happening?" "You've been gone for hours. I've been sitting here." I said, "Ashley, put on your coat." She said, "Why?" "Alan, what?" I said, "Just put on your coat. I'm coming to get you. There's someone I need you to see." A pause. And then my wife of 34 years, the woman who argues with stop signs, who cried every Sunday at a grave, who made a pot roast that Rob Anthony had complimented with criminal insincerity, said, in a voice so small and so enormous at the same time, "Is it her?" I started the car. I said, "Put on your coat, Ashley. Some answers don't need words." She knew. And 3 miles across Columbus, in a pale yellow house on a quiet street, my daughter was sitting on a couch waiting for the most important conversation of her life. The grave was empty. The girl was found. And Alan Whitmore, retired teacher, neighborhood rib champion, world-class fool for $62,400, drove toward the most complicated, most painful, most inexplicably beautiful moment of his 58 years on this earth. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.